Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Christian DiSpigna, and today we're delighted to welcome back my friend and co-host J.L. Bell, author of The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, and also the creator of the vastly popular blog, Boston 1775. Today, we will be discussing Crispus Attucks, a name familiar to most of us since our early grade school days, but also a figure we really don't know much about. And today's guest is going to help us navigate through nearly 3 centuries of the actual and the mythic story that has surrounded Addicts.
Mitch Kachun is Professor Emeritus of History at Western Michigan University. He earned his doctorate from history from Cornell University, and he specializes in African American history, collective memory, and historical writing. We've asked Professor Kachun to chat with us today because he is the author of First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks in American Memory, now available in paperback from Oxford University Press. Mitch Kachun is also the author of Festivals of Freedom, Memory and Meaning in African American Emancipation Celebrations, 1808 to 1915, and co-editor of The Curse of Caste or The Slave Bride, a rediscovered African American novel by Julia C. Collins, in addition to numerous articles and book chapters. Kachun's current research focuses on African American journalist Charles Stewart, who wrote featured columns for several Black newspapers in the early 20th century. Mitch, welcome to the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interview series.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here.
Mitch, I just want to start off with this question. How did you come to study African American history, and in particular, African American commemorations in media?
Well, you know, I started grad school without having a real focus other than American history, cultural history generally. It seemed that every class that I took, I seemed to gravitate toward topics relating to African Americans. And I was really pretty ignorant of African American history when I entered grad school. And I was just drawn to these topics. And the more I read and the more research papers I wrote and consulting with colleagues and mentors, the more it became clear to me that you can't really understand American history without really taking full account of the African-American presence from the very beginning. And so I just moved into that field. And in terms of memory studies, when I went to Cornell for my PhD, I worked with Michael Kamen, who had just, that was in the early 90s, he had just published his massive book, Mystic Chords of Memory, relating to memory and tradition in American culture. So that certainly had an influence on my orientation toward thinking about commemoration and memory and so on. And in Michael's book, great book, I think it's a path-breaking book, but wasn't a heck of a lot on African American history. And that really sort of got me thinking about, well, there's got to be a story there, multiple stories there. And right. I started to look into those, and it turned into my dissertation, which looked at primarily 19th century and early 20th century emancipation celebrations, which took place, of course, well before U.S. emancipation, with celebrations of the abolition of the slave trade, West Indian emancipation in the 1830s, and so on. And that's sort of where I stumbled onto Crispus Attucks.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. First Martyr of Liberty is about Crispus Attucks, but it's not a biography. It's a history of what Attucks has represented in American culture. So to ground us as we get deeper into that topic, Mitch, tell us what biographical detail we really know about the real Crispus Attucks.
Not a heck of a lot. And scholars have looked for generations for biographical information about him, but what we can say with a significant degree of certainty, he was probably born in or around the Framingham, Massachusetts area in the 1720s. More than likely was pretty clearly of mixed race, and most accounts and what seems to be the most plausible stories have him with an African-born father and a Native American mother. where the surname Addicts would come from. Why he doesn't have the father's surname, how that works is really unclear. We have no real documentation of his early family history. There was a runaway ad in 1750 for a large mulatto man named Crispus, who had escaped from William Brown of Framingham. And it's most scholars agree that that's probably the same Crispus. It's a very uncommon name. He's described very similarly to the man who shows up in 1770. So after that successful escape from servitude in 1750, more than likely he spent most of that time as a sailor, working around the docks around the Atlantic seaboard. We have some evidence from the time of the Boston Massacre that he was based in the Bahamas, and New Providence is the town, the name at that time. He was about to sail for North Carolina. So it seems pretty clear he was not a resident of Boston. It's unclear how frequently he popped into Boston on his rounds across the Atlantic. We don't know how far afield he went, if he was involved in trade across the Atlantic, if it was mainly up and down the seaboard. And of course, he meets his fate March 5th, 1770, with several other colonists.
Right. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, Mitch. How did people of Boston in March 1770 respond, in particular to Attucks' death? I mean, was he treated differently from other victims of the Boston Massacre?
Yes and no. He was identified, well, initially he was misidentified in the first newspaper accounts that came out as Michael Johnson. And that's actually the name that shows up on his autopsy report. And I'm really unclear as to whether most people have just sort of assumed that, well, since he was from the area, he was using a different name while he was in Boston, so he wouldn't be found out. But I think it's just as likely that that maybe there was another black seaman in Boston at that time named Michael Johnson who looked like Addicts, and he was simply misidentified. So I'm not sure which story is there. But in any case, he was identified as a mulatto, so a man of mixed race. And in those initial accounts, at least, and certainly in the trial of the soldiers, which came later in 1770, the soldiers and then the Captain Preston, John Adams, who was the lead defense attorney for those soldiers, really singled Addicts out, using a lot of different kinds of derogatory phrases. Right. One, he had set out to become the hero of the night, which he did not mean in a laudatory way. That he was the chief mischief maker. In one phrase, he says, the very looks of Addicts was enough to terrify anyone. So really calling and making it clear that he was an Addicts of Framingham. So that would clearly connote to Bostonians that this was an outsider. This was not a man from Boston. And this is, to a large extent, what Addicts was doing in his defense. He had to walk a fine line there because he did not want to get on the wrong side of Boston's growing patriot movement. So he really casts these instigators of the action on March 5th as outsiders. There was this Irishman, Patrick Carr, this Addicts from Framingham, this mixed race man whose looks was enough to terrify anyone. He said at one point, I think even to call this group a mob is too respectable for them. So he cast Addicts in a very negative light, and he was successful in getting the soldiers acquitted.
And moving ahead in time, how did Americans remember Addicts in the first decades after the Revolution, and what forces and what people brought him into public attention again on his way to becoming a household name?
Yeah, well, he sort of got collectively grouped with the other four men who were killed that day in the orations that took place every March 5th from 1771 to 1783. And that was discontinued, of course, with the end of the Revolution, and July 4th became the date of celebration. But in Boston, these orations, which of course Dr. Warren gave a couple of those orations in the early 1770s, Generally the individuals were not named. I think only John Hancock just names them, just listing their names. The rest don't even mention them. They're just collectively referred to as our brethren, our fellow citizens, slaughtered by this tyrannical standing army. So in that sense, Attucks, and he's buried, of course, collectively with the other soldiers in the old granary burying ground. So he is not treated differently in that respect, and he is lauded, although unnamed and not racially identified, so that people reading about the massacre after those first accounts in Boston or outside of the city, because that news spread throughout the colonies, they would have no idea that there was a person of color who was among the victims. He's mentioned in a couple early histories of the Revolution in the 1780s and 1790s. He shows up, but really he disappears from American collective memory, and even African Americans do not make any reference to him that I have found, and I've looked pretty hard, until the late 1830s, when I have a reference of a sermon being given in Boston by a Black minister named J.C. Beeman in 1839, and he makes reference to Addicts. He gets the last name wrong, but it's clear who he's talking about. And of course, William C. Nell, well-known Boston abolitionist. The first reference that I have, well, Nell was present at that celebration where Beeman mentions him. And then in 1841, there's some correspondence between him and Nell and Wendell Phillips, where he mentions his research trying to look into the life of Addicts and not finding much. So what happened, I think, in the 1830s was that you have the revolutionary generation. There was a new round of pensions being doled out. Of course, the 50th anniversary had just passed of the Declaration. And in the 1830s, George Robert Twelves Hughes publishes a couple of his, a couple of memoirs of his are published. And there was also a history of the revolution by an Italian historian named Carlo Botta that came out in 1820, but there were multiple editions in the 1830s. So that's where I think Nell came across, Crispus Attucks initially, and that's what got him sort of as the momentum for a biracial abolitionist movement was really accelerating in the 1830s and into the 1840s. Attucks became very useful for Black abolitionists, making their case not only for abolition, but for full and equal citizenship rights.
Yeah, and I just on a personal note, I was shocked at how many times they got Attucks's name wrong. How many people, it was just shocking to me. And you mentioned Dr. Joseph Warren, and I'm glad because there's a frontispiece from 1855, and it's portraying Attucks in a very similar vein to Dr. Joseph Warren and John Trumbull's painting, The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, which is emphasizing Attucks as a victim. So there's other antebellum descriptions and portrayals that really cast Attucks in a much more aggressive role. So can you discuss the different portrayals and what the creator's intentions were?
Yeah, that Trumbull painting, the similarities are really striking. And It's almost this pietà kind of pose. So there's this sort of the martyrdom of Christ is brought into this mix as well. And that painting was pretty well known in the first half of the 19th century. So I think that was a very conscious choice for the frontispiece of this. Again, it was William Nell's book, Colored Patriots of the Revolution, presenting Attucks as a martyr. And he was referred there as the first martyr of the American Revolution. But yeah, there were other characterizations in images and in text. Even as early as the early 1830s, I found an 1831 school book written by Samuel Goodrich, Peter Parley fame. Samuel Goodrich had a very negative interpretation of Attucks's role, very similar to what John Adams was laying out in the trial, that this was, and the mob in general. He characterized the mob as attacking the soldiers without provocation, and they basically got what they deserved. And there's a small image with a Black man holding a club over his head, which is consistent with descriptions of eyewitnesses at the trial. the subtitle of that image, the caption was something like "People attacking the soldiers." So it was a very negative, aggressive characterization.
Right.
But then in the 1850s, you have this lithograph by Bufford and Champney. I'm not sure, I forget the sequence now, but showing also in the center of the image, somewhat similar in the background to Paul Revere's famous image of the massacre, but having a black man at the center holding a club. And in this case, the aggressiveness is usually interpreted as a positive thing, like using that assertive, aggressive stance against the tyrannical standing army in order to assert American independence. So there's quite a lot going on in that period.
Earlier, Mitch, you mentioned Attucks's Native American ancestry, and how, if any way, did that affect his symbolic place in American history, especially in this period of westward expansion?
It really didn't, as far as I can tell. And I've given other talks about the book and had Q&A with folks, some of whom have asserted that William Nell, for example, who really was the most significant figure in bringing back Attucks's memory and creating an image of him, a symbolic image to fight for Black citizenship rights as someone who was there at the founding, so to speak. That people like Nell acknowledged Attucks's Native ancestry, but I don't see that. In fact, just earlier today, I went and revisited Colored Patriots and read the section on Attucks, and he's referenced there as a mulatto, in one place as a black man. And this was the thing about Nell and Black abolitionists in general. They wanted to really emphasize his African-American ancestry. They did not really, sometimes a passing mention of Native ancestry, but it was often not even acknowledged at all. Because they wanted to emphasize the fight for Black citizenship. And Native peoples, and this is speculation on my part, because I haven't really found any sources from Native peoples referencing Attucks, but to me, it just seems that they're not so much concerned as African Americans were with asserting their American citizenship. They were more focused in this period on emphasizing their own sovereignty, their own national sovereignty. So Attucks was not a useful figure for them in the same way that he was for Black Americans.
I couldn't help but think when I was reading the book that really Attucks seems like a paradox, right? I think we can all agree that of all the massacre victims, he has the most name recognition, right? So here's this working class person of color involved in one of the most iconic events in early American history, but really relegated to somewhat of a token footnote, right? He's martyred in the cause of liberty. He's portrayed throughout our history as both a hero and a villain. So can you comment on some of these tensions and paradoxes of Crispus Attucks's memory?
Yeah, and this takes us into the 20th and 21st centuries as well, because there's a lot of, there are multiple different ways of looking at Attucks. From both Blacks and whites, and eventually Native people. So you have these two characterizations that predominate in the 19th century of the Black abolitionists and white abolitionists as well, looking at Attucks as someone who was a patriot. He was a martyr to the cause of liberty. He demonstrates the African Americans' citizenship rights should be acknowledged. And on the other hand, he was this rabble rouser. He was probably this drunken sailor who was just out looking to bust some heads on March 5th, and that's that. And he was really a threat to the social order. But even in the beginning in the mid 19th century, even, but more prominently after the 1930s and into the 1960s, there were some African Americans who saw Attucks as sort of a sellout. That here he was, risking his life. He was this assertive, aggressive man, but he was fighting not for Black liberation, but for the white enslavers who were behind the revolution. You see references to that in the 1930s, and I note in the book, Stokely Carmichael, key figure in the Black Power movement in the 1960s, made those kinds of references to addicts that, he shouldn't have been doing that. He should have been fighting for Black people. And several John Rock, who was an abolitionist and a very interesting figure in himself in the mid 19th century, even in some of the earliest commemorations, March 5th commemorations in Boston in, I think, 1859 and 60, John Rock said, I'd rather celebrate the deeds of Nat Turner or John Brown than Crispus Attucks, because, again, they were fighting for Black liberation. Right. And there's lots of other people who have argued over the years, the image of him as a rabble rouser and a troublemaker persists. There was one incident in 2000, the year 2000, there was an effort to get a bridge in Framingham named for Crispus Attucks. And the eminent revolutionary historian Pauline Meyer was interviewed by a newspaper, and she was quoted as saying, this is a fairly close paraphrase, that Attucks was identified as someone who was coming up, leading a band of 20 sailors up Corn Hill, and he was carrying a large club. He sounds like a thug to me. So even in that context, he's characterized in that way. Right. But others still say, look, this guy shouldn't be in the history books at all. He's a nobody. He's probably a troublemaker. He didn't make any great contribution to American history. So he should, and especially in the 1960s, as textbooks begin to include African Americans, Attucks comes in as a very convenient token of the Black presence in the Revolutionary era. You put in you have a little section on the Boston Massacre, which virtually all elementary, middle school, high school, collegiate textbooks have a section on the Boston Massacre. You just add a sentence that there's a Black man there, and that's sort of, you've done your due diligence. You've fulfilled the obligation of including a Black face in this story, right. And that's really insufficient. But so that's sort of the range that we're dealing with in terms of how Attucks is characterized.
Yeah. Over the decades, there have been many organizations, schools, and other institutions named after Attucks. There have been children's books, there have been comic books, often in imaginative detail. And so are there patterns in the myths and misconceptions that have accreted around Attucks as a symbol? And while we're talking about that, tell us about the image on the front cover of your book.
Yeah, let's talk about that, yeah. And thanks for holding it up so everyone can see. I love the phrase imaginative detail, which is a nice way of saying people just made stuff up. And that's really a lot of what was going on, because, again, we have so little concrete evidence that can be verified about his life, that he's sort of a blank slate, that people can impose whatever meaning suits their purpose, whether it is to characterize him as a rowdy villain troublemaker, or as the patriotic martyr to the cause of liberty, or anything else. So yeah, and mythology is widespread, and Black, by the end of the 19th century, he shows up. I mentioned the Samuel Goodrich school book that mentions Attucks in a negative light. There are numerous school books throughout the antebellum period and the Civil War era that did mention Attucks either in a positive or negative light. It was sort of a mix. But after the 1880s, he disappears from any accounts in mainstream school books that I have found. I didn't look at every single school book after the 1880s, but from the 1880s into the 1960s, or maybe the late 1950s, the Civil Rights era, Attucks is not in any mainstream school books, history books about the American Revolutionary era. So African American writers have to rely on their own works to maintain his memory, to keep his memory alive, and they do that beginning in the 1880s by often creating stories about Attucks. A couple of key books that came out in the 1880s, one by William Simmons and one by George Washington Williams. I've almost blanked on the name there. Really construct an Addicts who was well-read. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty. He was a close associate of John Adams. He was good looking. You find so all kinds of things that we just don't know about this man. He was well versed in political philosophy, and these things sort of get recycled over and over across the generations in a lot of by the 20th century, in a lot of juvenile biographies about addicts. There are a lot of collective biographies of Black heroes that start appearing in the 1920s and 30s, and he always has a prominent place there. And often he's mischaracterized, and often because of these things getting repeated over and over again, when he does start to show up in mainstream textbooks, school books in the after the 1960s, some of these myths are recycled about him being a member of the Sons of Liberty or things along those lines. So it was challenging to tease out what we can know and what was fabricated and where some of these stories came from.
Yeah.
And the cover of your book shows one very dramatic portrayal, which we didn't get to see, right?
Which we didn't get to see?
Well, except on your book.
Except on the book, that's right, and inside the book. Yeah, and this relates, starting in the late 30s, there were several efforts to get a Hollywood film made about the life of Crispus Attucks. And none of these ever came to fruition. The image on the cover there is from a projected film from the early 1970s. And it was the film was to be titled Crispus, and it got, I guess, far enough into production that they hired a fairly well-known graphic artist named Robert Frankenberg to create that image. And I was fortunate enough to get a hold of the person. He's still alive. He's in his 90s, retired in Boca Raton, Florida, who was the president of the film company. Thank goodness for Google as a historical researcher. That's how I found got the rights to this image. He was very gracious, and what is really striking about it, one of you can hold it up again.
Yeah.
Here is Crispus Attucks. Okay, he's got the club over his head the way a couple of the 19th century images does, but here he is bare-chested.
Right.
So think about the early 1970s. This is the era of the blaxploitation films, right? Shaft and Superfly and Dolomite and all these guys. Right. So you have this bare-chested Attucks literally flying across. His feet are not touching the ground in that image, which wraps around the spine of the book. So, and I love just the dynamic nature of it. I was really happy to be able to get the rights and use that image.
Right. And
thanks for asking about it too.
Okay, and so, Mitch, let me just ask you this. So during the eras of slavery, rampant discrimination, Attucks was an important symbol for African Americans. So what symbolic value does he hold in America today, and for whom? Is he more famous or popular than ever? And has our culture found other figures to represent the same ideas?
Yeah, the symbolic role that he plays today, to a large extent, is much the same as what the abolitionists constructed in the mid-19th century. He is the First Martyr of Liberty. He is a patriotic hero. He is a man who laid down his life for the independence of the nation. And that's, for people who recognize his name at all, often he's just, wasn't he the black guy from the Revolution, and really not know much more than that. Many people, the name means nothing to them at all. But for those who do know something about him and attach some significance to him, most, and certainly most African Americans, and I think many white Americans and others as well, continue to see him in that patriotic light. And it's worth noting that Native Americans, particularly some of the nations around the Boston, Eastern Massachusetts area, now do acknowledge him and actually several different groups claim him as one of their own. So that's something that's changed a little bit. In terms of, there are lots of other figures that have played similar kinds of roles. And I focus on Addicts, and that's all I write about in the book. I barely mention some of the others, but there are certainly lots and lots of figures, including people who have an association with violence, people like Denmark Vesey, who now has a monument in Charleston, and
Right.
Nat Turner, we're still waiting for a monument for him. Addicts still has, Addicts has the monument on Boston Common, but that's really generally the Boston Massacre monument. So he plays that symbolic role. Many people do still consider him irrelevant, and basically taking up space in the American narrative that should have more prominent people involved. But to me, one of the interesting roles that he plays, he sort of feeds into this trope of violence in our culture that's often associated with Black males, and especially large Black males. Attucks was a large man, 6'2", over 200 pounds, and that was certainly quite large in the 18th century. And that's one of the reasons African Americans had this balancing act that they had to play. They promoted Attucks as an assertive man who was asserting his rights as an individual and his citizenship in a nation that was yet to be born, and through that establishing a claim to citizenship. But on the other hand, this image of a large Black man exercising violence in the public sphere is a very persistent trope in our culture. And certainly John Adams played into that in the trial. Many commentators in the 19th and 20th centuries played into that, and still in the 21st. It's interesting. Journalist Amy Goodman from the Democracy Now! Network made a comment shortly after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. On Addicts Day, March 5th, 2015, she had a short commentary in which she compares the two men and basically saying that here were two large Black men who were struck down by authority figures of their day, British Army and troops, and neither of those authority figures were punished in any way for the death of this large Black man. The circumstances are surely different, but she was making the point. I think her comment was something along the lines of, you never know what's going to start a revolution, and Black lives matter. So I think that's a very timely thing in terms of how I think Attucks should be remembered today, what symbolic value I think he should have. I don't think it really matters whether or not he was a man who had American patriotism burning in his heart, and he had these high ideals that he was fighting for. What he really symbolizes to me is the presence of people of color, mixed race, African and Native man. And there were other people of color in that crowd on March 5th, 1770. And many people who are not steeped in the time period don't realize that 1 out of every 5 American colonists at that time was of African descent. Certainly a lot more in South Carolina and Virginia than in a place like Boston. But even in Boston, you had Black people and Native people playing these kind of public roles. And I think that's something that is lost on a lot of people who tend to see colonial and revolutionary America as a very white place. So I think that's the way we should remember him. And I think that his presence should help us reorient the way we think about American history, and help to move us away from this kind of triumphalist narrative that has always excluded people of color, excluded or marginalized or vilified Black people like Attucks, and to reorient us around and recenter our understanding of American history around the presence of Black people. And certainly the institution of slavery is a central component of American history that is often downplayed as this sort of thing that happened on the side, and then we fixed it, and then it all goes away. And I think that's not a healthy way to move forward as we're seeking to establish some kind of restorative justice in our society in the 21st century. We have to come to terms with the presence of people like Attucks, the presence of slavery, and the central role that they played in shaping American history and culture.
Right. That's a great point.
And a more general question about memory and how we remember the movement towards American independence. We tend to have a natural tendency to look for heroes, to look for virtues. And do you think that that is indeed the best way to read history, or is it just something that every human falls into?
It does seem to be a persistent pattern, and not just in American culture, certainly around the world, establishing a heroic narrative. Every nation needs a story that to orient its own citizens and people from outside the nation and it's always, it tends to be a very progressive and triumphalist and positive and progressive story of steady improvement. We've certainly seen that in our society. So yeah, I don't know that it seems that it's necessary in order to construct those kinds of narratives. And certainly after the 18th, 19th century, as Western nations are establishing their identity as nations, they all craft these narratives, these triumphalist narratives, to give people a real stake in the society and to construct a nation, to construct that kind of collective identity. And certainly having heroes to look back to emulate, to idolize, to honor it with monuments and special days and so on. It's a very useful tool. And that's one of the things that fascinates me about studying collective memory and studying commemorations, is teasing out, how do these stories get constructed? How does a person get to be a hero? Whose purposes does that serve? Who creates these narratives? Who decides which people are going to be ignored and which people are going to be honored with monuments and so on? And certainly that's a relevant conversation to have in our society today, especially with all the conversation about Confederate memorials and monuments in the past decade or so. So those are convenient ways, but what's fascinating to me, and what I think people need to get to that next level of not just accepting the heroic narrative, but figuring out why that narrative got constructed the way it did. And that gives, I think, a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the history you're trying to bring forward.
Right. Well, this has been great. And this concludes the interview with Mitch Kachun, author of First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks, and American Memory. And Mitch, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll come back.
I really enjoyed it. I'll be glad to come back when you ask me.
Thank you. And on behalf of J.L. Bell and myself, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.